It's just after 1 PM on a Thursday in Toronto. The underground lot at 2265 Jane Street is dim and half empty. It's silent except for the low hum of traffic from above. On security footage, a young woman walks towards a stairwell. She has her headphones in. She doesn't see the man fast approaching from behind. The two argue. Her hands go up in defense. He unzips a backpack and pulls out something horrifying. She tries to run. He blocks her. She pleads. But it would make no difference. When police arrive just minutes later, they discover the woman, and the man is already gone. August the 15th, 2022. It's the middle of a muggy afternoon in Toronto. Outside a small apartment building on Finch Avenue, 23-year-old Daniela Malia stands under a tree, visibly shaken. Two uniformed officers, Constable Sang-Yu Lee and Anton Alfonso, approach her. Their body cameras are rolling. I actually wrote a breakdown of this body cam footage, but honestly, nothing will do it justice other than just watching it. I really do want to know what you think of the cops' behaviour here, and the clip is only a couple of minutes, and it's definitely worth watching to the end.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll give him a call. I think he lives in Brampton or somewhere, side of town, right? We'll give him a call, try to talk and get his side of the story too.
Yeah.
And also, you told him to stop, please stop, right? Which is the right thing to do. We read it, right? At the same time, you should stop talking to him too.
Yeah.
Even though you don't have to warn him.
So, yeah, I know.
Stop, and all.
Gotta cut it clean.
You just cut it.
I tried so many times.
Well, I know you tried so many times.
Yes. And it's so hard.
It is. So we'll make a report, right? We'll make a report. Everything's being recorded, our body wing camera and everything. We'll make a report here. Then we'll talk with Dylan. What's his understanding? Dylan? Okay. And we'll talk to him too. Stop. Move on with his life.
Okay, we're gonna get a statement from you.
I'm trying.
Okay. All right. So we'll make a note in our police database, right? That we'll keep it track of this, right?
Yeah.
He knows that you live here?
Yeah.
Okay, so in terms of... Do you live with anyone else?
Yeah,
Who do you
I
live with?
do. I live with someone and his mother.
Where?
A guy and his mom. I literally rent a room.
Okay, so you live with a guy and his mom. Okay. Are they aware of this?
I just told her, yeah.
Okay.
She is.
Okay. And you have a lock your door, okay? If he ever shows up here, lock your door, call 911.
I already told him don't ever show up because he knows it's going to happen. Like,
No,
you guys are already here.
just hear me out. I'm telling you, if he shows up, knocking on your door, doors always to remain locked, call 911 and we'll come here immediately. Okay? So that's the safety plan, okay? If he shows up at your work, it's a good thing that you've already told your manager about it, so they're aware of it. What do you do for work, if you don't mind me asking?
I work at Pet Value.
You work at Pet Value, okay. So
Nothing wrong with that.
I know, it's just funny at this moment. Like,
And where is that Pet Value? They have a lot of locations.
This was yesterday when I was at work.
Okay.
Oh, you're still alive, blah, blah, blah.
And your manager knows about it as well. Okay,
Yeah,
so
and the owner as well.
So that's a good thing as well, that the employees and the manager and everyone knows,
Yes.
so they can keep you safe there. And if he does show up there, again, same thing, call 911.
They already know. They're ready. They'll lock the door and call 911.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
That's good. That's good.
So we need to also do a statement with you to get this one statement. Obviously, there's going to be charges laid here, okay? But at the end of the day, also, it's a he said, she said, right? Because he's talking to you, giving you threats, and you're like instigating him back on, right? It would be different if he was giving it to you and you just cut it and called us straight. Unfortunately, this is the circumstance that we're in right now, okay? Are you okay with us doing a statement?
Just think about it, and do you have a driver license?
No, I have a whole car.
That's not okay. Just think about it. Let me talk with my partner for a second, okay?
So, just to recap, Daniela had split up with her partner, a man named Dylan Dowman. He had sent her messages saying, "You're still breathing 'cause I say so," and "Ain't no coming back from death, you're done." And later that same day, Daniela sent the screenshots of Dylan's threats to the police officers. Officer Lee's response was emailing both Daniela and Dylan, telling both of them to stop contacting each other. However, no charges are filed, no follow-up is scheduled, and no supervisor is alerted of the situation. And nobody, not one single person, flags this situation as a case of intimate partner violence. Now August the 16th, Daniela had made contact with the police. She'd shared the evidence with them, and the messages one after the other made it clear that Dylan wasn't just angry, he was fixated on Daniela. And frustratingly, what Daniela didn't know at that point was that Dylan Dowman was already subject to a firearms prohibition. That means that any credible threat, especially from someone legally barred from owning a weapon, should have been grounds for immediate action by the police. Instead, the officers interpret the evidence they were sent as mutual harassment. Officer Lee emails Daniela again, and he warns her to stop contacting Dowman or risk being arrested herself. In that same email, he tells her, "This is a written caution, move on with your life." Daniela doesn't respond. However, Dylan Dowman does. Dylan sent his own email to the police, and in it he claimed that Daniela had admitted to lying to the police because at the time she was high. He even attached screenshots of messages hoping to flip the script and make himself look completely innocent. Officer Lee's reaction was to tell Dylan Dowman to block Daniela's number. So there's still no official investigation that's been opened. There's no charges. There's no referral to an intimate partner violence unit. No one even flags the case in the system. However, by law, officers in Ontario are required to press charges when there's reasonable evidence of intimate partner violence. And this, messages threatening death, a firearm prohibition, a visibly frightened woman, this should have easily met that standard. However, the whole thing is just treated like a lover's spat, like a miscommunication or a misunderstanding. Police tried to make out that they were both as bad as each other, and as the second day dawns, Daniela is still waiting for peace and waiting for help. On August the 17th, there's no record of direct contact between Daniela and the officers on that day, but behind the scenes, her fear was growing. She had told the officers that she didn't feel safe staying in her own apartment, and now it's believed that she was actively avoiding being at home. Her colleagues at Pet Value would later say that she was more tense than usual on that day, that she was behaving in a distracted manner. They didn't know that Dylan Dowman had already started watching her movements. It's believed that sometime on August the 17th, Dylan Dowman began planning his attack. Surveillance would later show him lying in wait near to Daniela's building the next morning. Court documents revealed that he rented a room in a house not far from Daniela's apartment, but by that point he was already coordinating his escape route. He wanted to do something terrible, and then he wanted to get away. So despite the officer's assurances that Dylan had been warned, he was still obviously undeterred. He'd been given a 3-minute phone call, and that was it. There was no formal warning letter, there was no in-person visit, and there was no risk assessment of the wider situation. Even after officers Lee and Alfonso had received written proof of threats, and even after Daniela told them that she was afraid that he might end her life, there was no protective actions taken. On the morning of August the 18th, Dylan Dowman left the home that he'd been renting. He calls an Uber. He was carrying a backpack, and inside that backpack was a hidden firearm. That court-ordered firearms ban was not going to stop him today. The Uber driver drops him off near 2265 Jane Street, just north of Highway 401, and there, Dylan Dowman waits. He carried on waiting patiently for 90 minutes. He stood just out of view of CCTV, watching the courtyard outside the apartment complex. He was just waiting for Daniela to appear. She wasn't at home at that time because she was actively trying to stay away. But when it's your home, you can't do that forever. Eventually, she came walking along a path. It was just past 1 p.m. She was wearing headphones, and perhaps she was listening to music. Her co-workers say that she had a playlist that she loved, one that they still play in store for Daniela. Daniela didn't see her ex, not until it was too late. Dylan moved fast. He runs up behind Daniela and grabs her tight. There's no time to scream. He dragged her into the building's underground parking garage, and from there, the camera catches almost everything. The surveillance footage is silent. but you don't need sound to feel what's happening. In the dim underground light, Daniela and Dauman argue. She is pleading, trying to get past him, but he blocks her path. He pulls the backpack off his shoulder and then unzips it. He reaches inside and pulls out the firearm. Daniela tries to escape again, but there's nowhere to go. He raised up the weapon, and 6 loud bangs crack out into existence. Daniela falls, and she doesn't move again. According to the coroner, her end was likely almost instant. Dylan stands over her for a moment, and then calmly steps over her body, zips up his bag, and walks out of frame. Security footage shows him just walking down the street. There's no rush, no panic. He boards a TTC bus and rides it to a nearby shopping mall, where he disappears into the crowds for the rest of the afternoon. Later, a fellow resident of the complex named George Lakatosh walks into the parking garage. He sees a green bag on the floor, follows the line of sight, and then he sees Daniela lying still. I never saw her move, he later testified in court. Daniela's time on this earth officially came to an end on the scene. When the trial began in February of 2025, Crown Attorney Maureen Pecknold addressed the jury with a chilling opening. "This is not a complicated case," she said, and over the course of the trial, jurors were shown hours of footage and surveillance. But none of it hit harder than the officer's own body cam from August the 15th, the day that Daniela begged for help. The jury watched Daniela cry just as we did, as she tried to explain why she feared Dylan Dauman so greatly. They saw her show the messages, "You're still breathing 'cause I say so. You're done," and they saw the officers push back, accusing her of instigating, calling the whole thing he said, she said. Pecknold told jurors that Daniela gave police everything that they needed: motive, digital evidence, and context. She told them she didn't feel safe, Pecknold said. She gave them the playbook. They did nothing. And 3 days later, Dylan Dauman followed through with his promises. He did exactly what he said he would, and now that man was facing first-degree murder charges. Inside the courtroom, Daniela's younger sister Tashona stood to speak. "She loved you when she shouldn't have," she said, "but you were lucky to receive it." Her voice broke as she added, "I turned 25 this year, older than my role model. What made me better than her?" Dylan Dauman declined to speak in court. However, Daniela's father took his chance to say what he wanted. Wearing a shirt with his daughter's face on it, he shouted across the courtroom, "You get what you deserve. You should get 50 on top of it." In February of 2025, the jury found Dylan Dauman guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison, with no chance of parole for 25 years. He showed no emotion as the verdict was read.
Toronto's Police Chief Myron Demke has met with Malia's family, issuing a statement that reads in part, "I am concerned about the alleged misconduct in this case and want to reassure the public that officers respond to intimate partner violence calls on a daily basis, and they do so with compassion and professionalism. Those who fail to follow procedure or to meet our clear professional standards will be held to account." Police confirm Alfonso's partner, Constable Sang-Yub Lee, is also facing misconduct charges, but hasn't appeared before the tribunal yet.
Officer Sang-Yub Lee later pled guilty to misconduct, and he was demoted for 1 year. Constable Anson Alfonso's charges remain pending. And Daniela, kind, joyful, and just 23, was laid to rest by those who loved her most. This could and should have been avoided. The old Pontiac sat forgotten in the corner of a dusty Pueblo scrapyard. It had been there for years, sun-bleached, rusting, and silent. But in February of 2024, police officers arrived with a warrant, and they carefully opened the trunk. Inside, they found a suitcase. Inside that suitcase, something wrapped, small, and heartbreakingly fragile. It was a discovery that would reopen a case that nobody even knew existed, because that discovery belonged to Jesus Jr., who, along with his sister Yesenia, had vanished 6 years earlier, and in all that time, nobody had ever officially reported them missing. How could 2 children just disappear and nobody notice for 6 whole years? To understand that question, we have to start somewhere else entirely. A storage unit on West 6th Street back in January. And I'll give you one final warning. This one is truly heartbreaking and horrifying. It started with a smell and a mother's instinct that something wasn't right. On the morning of January the 20th, 2024, Karina Minyares' mother was helping her daughter to clear out a storage unit at King Storage on West 6th Street, based in Pueblo, Colorado. Karina and her boyfriend, Jesus Dominguez Sr., had been living out of that unit, but they were now being evicted for non-payment. So Karina's mother came to help, but she quickly became concerned about a large metal container pushed up against the wall. It was sealed shut, it was heavy, and something about it just felt off. She opened it and inside was a trash can, and inside that trash can, encased in hardened concrete, were what appeared to be human remains. Obviously horrified, she contacted the police. Authorities responded just after 8:30 a.m. and the scene was quickly locked down. The Special Victims Unit and the crime scene team were called in, and within 2 days, authorities confirmed what the mother had feared. Inside that trash can, inside the concrete, was the body of a girl. Police began trying to identify the remains and the people who had been renting out the unit, and that search obviously led them to Karina Minyares and Jesus Dominguez Sr., both aged 37. Just to clarify here, Jesus Sr. was the 2 children's father, and Karina was the children's stepmother. The children's biological mother was a woman named Alberta. And actually, quite interestingly, Jesus Sr. and Karina originally met as pen pals, whilst Jesus was in prison. I hope that all makes sense. I just wanted to help set the scene. At the time, neither of them seemed particularly alarmed. They sat for interviews with detectives. They offered vague timelines and even floated the idea that the 2 children, 3-year-old Yesenia and 5-year-old Jesus Jr., were still alive and possibly living with relatives in Arizona. But when detectives followed up on that lead, it went nowhere. Nobody in Arizona had seen either of the children, and come to think of it, no one in Colorado had either. In fact, as Pueblo police soon discovered, nobody anywhere had seen either child since the summer of 2018, 6 years earlier. That was when everything changed. A DNA match confirmed that the remains in the concrete did indeed belong to Yesenia Dominguez. Her brother, though, was still missing, and police now had very good reason to believe that he too may not be alive. Investigators started asking the couple about cars, and this is because one family member remembered something strange about Karina's old Pontiac Grand Am. A foul smell, to be specific. A smell that never quite went away. When Yesenia's remains were identified in January of 2024, one question rang louder than the rest. How did nobody notice these children were missing? Between 2018 and 2024, there was no missing persons report filed for either child, no school alerts, no medical checkups missed, no welfare checks requested. Instead, friends and extended family were told a simple rehearsed lie, that Jesus Jr. and Yesenia had gone to live with relatives in Arizona. And since Jesus Dominguez Sr. was the children's biological father, and Karina Minyares was their legal guardian during this time, there was no immediate reason to question it. The couple even continued collecting government benefits for the children, long after the time that the kids could be accounted for. Behind closed doors, though, within the family, there were concerns. Barbara Sanchez says that her relationship with the 2 children is like a second grandmother to them, and a second mother to their biological mother, Alberta. Barbara and Alberta were tied together in a kind of web made up from Jesus Sr.'s previous relationships. So Barbara Sanchez, this second grandmother, noticed that she wasn't seeing the kids anymore. She also remembered Karina snapping at her, saying, Why do you care? You're not their grandmother. Whenever Barbara or the children's mother Alberta tried to visit, they were blocked from doing so. At one point, the group even drove to Karina's apartment in order to ask where the kids actually were. However, Karina called the police on them and then claimed once again that the children had simply moved out of state. And after that, they stopped asking. And for 6 long years, that story held out. Karina and Jesus Sr. then drifted in and out of housing, sometimes in motels, sometimes living in their car. They used Brown and Crystal regularly. They pawned their possessions and they moved on frequently. By the end of this period of time, they were living in a storage unit, one that was filled with junk, and a metal bin full of concrete. According to police, they never told anyone that the children were missing, and the only reason that investigators even began looking for them was because Yesenia was accidentally found, and now the fact that there was no sign of her brother was extremely concerning. And sadly, this concern would manifest into a dark reality very soon, because when detectives asked the couple about vehicles, a scrapyard on the outskirts of Pueblo had something that belonged to Karina, her old Pontiac Grand Am, the one she used to live in. And in the trunk of that car, under layers of cat litter, baby powder, and a comforter, lay a suitcase. And inside that suitcase was Jesus Jr. It happened on March the 14th, 2018. Dominguez Sr. later testified that he and Karina were driving her 2004 Pontiac Grand Am to pick up the kids and a nephew from school. He said it was an ordinary day, until that is, 3-year-old Yesenia had an accident in the back seat. She simply wet herself. But for Karina, this run-of-the-mill issue, one that is so easy to fix and then to comfort the child, was instead apparently unforgivable. Rather than clean Yesenia up and change her clothes, Karina instead pulled the car over and made her stepdaughter sit on the floor of the vehicle on top of a plastic bag. This was in order to keep the seats clean. Dominguez Sr. said she stayed there for the rest of the ride. By the time they arrived home, Karina claimed that Yesenia had stopped breathing. Neither adult called 911. Neither of them took her to the hospital or did anything to help. Dominguez Sr. later told the court that Karina panicked, and that is because Yesenia was already showing visible signs of maltreatment, including a bite mark on her hand. So, rather than getting help for Yesenia, they did the unthinkable. Karina told him the girl wasn't responding, so instead of getting help, they carried their daughter inside and placed her in a suitcase. At this time, they were living in a rental home, but eviction was looming. So when the sheriff came knocking a few days later to kick them out, they grabbed what they could and moved into the Pontiac, the same car in which Yesenia had met her end. She was now entombed in a suitcase, stashed away in the trunk. For the next several weeks, the couple lived inside the car. They were eating, sleeping, using substances, all whilst their son, Jesus Jr., was still alive, with his sister's remains rotting away just a few feet from him. Dominguez Sr. said the smell came slowly at first. They tried using baby powder and cat litter to mask it, but by April, it was unmistakable. Still though, he did nothing. Karina, meanwhile, had grown increasingly frustrated with Jesus Jr. He had now begun regressing in his toilet training, something that could well have been happening due to stress and anxiety or fear. He was 5 years old, remember. Every accident, though, seemed to trigger Karina's rage, a rage that had already claimed one life. So honestly, what chance did he stand? In court, Dominguez Sr. described the atmosphere inside the car as tense, filthy, and dangerous. They were regularly using illicit substances. They parked up in abandoned lots or behind gas stations. And each morning, they'd wake up beside the decomposing body of somebody that they should have loved and protected. But instead, they just carried on like nothing was wrong. Jesus Jr., Dominguez Sr. said, never asked about his sister. Horrifically, she was still so close physically, but she was gone in every other sense. From late March through to May of 2018, as the family continued to live in the car, the suitcase holding Yesenia's body remained sealed in the trunk. It was wrapped in plastic and surrounded by childish attempts to hide the smell. But that smell was growing harder and harder to ignore, especially as the seasons changed. In the back seat, 5-year-old Jesus Jr. was still alive, but what an absolutely horrifying thing to even begin to think about. He must have been so confused, isolated, trapped and scared. To think of him being so neglected and alone really breaks my heart. Poor, poor boy. Dominguez Sr. testified that Jesus Jr.'s behavior began to shift. He said he became quiet and anxious. He stopped playing altogether. His toilet training regressed further and further, and every small mistake, every accident, became a lightning rod for Karina's fury. Dominguez Sr. claimed that he tried to keep the peace, but peace was impossible in those conditions. He said Karina was using substances heavily by that point, and he was too. And now that money was running out, both adults were suffering the effects of withdrawal, paranoia, and exhaustion from a hectic life. The Pontiac Grand Am became a mobile family mausoleum. One part trap, one part crime scene, just a total nightmare. But despite everything, they kept on driving around. They used the car to run errands, to buy their next fix, and to sleep in shifts. According to Dominguez Sr., Karina would scream at Jesus Jr. for soiling himself. She once even threatened to tie him to the roof of the car. And another time, when he wet his pants once again, she dragged him to a self-service car wash and sprayed him down with a high-pressure hose. Dominguez said he was there when it happened. He said he remembered Jesus Jr. screaming. The water was cold and sharp, and it left red welts on the inner thighs. Still though, no hospital, no checkup, no help. The only thing they ever did was threaten him to stay quiet, and so he did. Dominguez Sr. described Jesus Jr. as withdrawn. He rarely spoke unless spoken to. He just sat there, clinging to old toys and stuffed animals. But then, even those small, final comforts were taken away from him as punishment. And while all of this was happening, his sister Yesenia's body remained just a few feet away, in the trunk in the suitcase, day after day, night after night, until finally, in late April or early May of 2018, Jesus Jr. would be with his sister once more. Dominguez Sr. claims that he stepped out of the car to run an errand, though that later turned out to be a pickup of substances. When he returned, Karina was in the front seat, and Jesus Jr. was now completely still. She turned to him and said, "He's not breathing." Dominguez Sr. claims that he froze. According to his later testimony, the scene in the Pontiac felt hauntingly familiar. Just like with Yesenia, Karina offered no explanation. There was no signs of panic, and there was no signs that she had tried to save his life. All she could say, "He's not breathing." The details of Jesus Jr.'s final moments remain murky. By the time he was found, no autopsy could determine the exact cause of his passing due to the decomp. The remains were far, far too gone. But what we do know is this: neither adult once again called 911. Nobody checked for a pulse. Perhaps he could have been saved. Instead, they just followed the same sick pattern as they had with Yesenia. Dominguez Sr. claimed they drove to a secluded spot near the Pueblo Dam, and there they retrieved another suitcase, one that they had been keeping in the back seat. They laid out multiple trash bags, and then they placed the body inside, wrapping it in layers of plastic and old blankets. Dominguez Sr. told the court he could barely look. Once the suitcase was sealed, they then stuffed it into the trunk, right next to Yesenia. Brother and sister, side by side, hidden inside this car from hell. After that, their spiral really accelerated. Dominguez said that he began using more heavily, just whatever substances they could now find. Dominguez Sr. said the Pontiac had now become unbearable, as if it wasn't before. Even through the air fresheners, cat litter and baby powder, the smell was now completely overwhelming. Eventually, the couple moved Yesenia's body from the car and into a metal trash can and filled it with concrete. They sealed it up and left it in the storage unit that they were living in. However, they kept the second suitcase containing Jesus Jr. inside the trunk. But when that car eventually stopped running later that year, they simply abandoned it. And with it, they abandoned Jesus Jr. once again. That vehicle was eventually sold for scrap. It was taken to a local junkyard, and there it was parked up and untouched for nearly 6 years. Nobody ever opened the trunk. No one asked any questions. And so, Karina and Dominguez Sr. continued their lives. They just kept on telling anybody that inquired that the kids now lived in Arizona, and so they had no funeral, no headstones, nobody grieving for them. They were reduced to a suitcase in a junkyard and a concrete-filled trash can, forming a makeshift tomb. But still, somehow, for almost 6 years, that lie held out. Until that is, as we know, Karina's own mother opened the lid of that metal bin in January of 2024, and the silence was now finally broken. When the truth finally surfaced in early 2024, the legal fallout would come fast. Karina and Dominguez Sr. were arrested in February, and each of them faced 2 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of a body. Dominguez Sr. faced a charge for government benefit fraud because, as we know, even after the children were gone, the couple continued to collect support that was meant for them. At first, both of them stayed silent, but then the prosecutors offered Dominguez Sr. a deal. If he testified against Karina, they would reduce his charge from first-degree murder to second-degree. He accepted, and in July, he stood in court and described what happened. The jury listened as he recounted the car, the smell, and the quiet suffering from inside the Pontiac. He spoke about Yesenia being made to sit on the plastic bag. He talked about the pressure washing incident. He repeated Karina's chilling words, "He's not breathing," all whilst Karina sat just feet away. When it was finally Karina's turn to speak, she didn't deny knowing what had happened. Instead, her defense told a different story. She said that she wasn't the killer, Dominguez Sr. was. Her lawyers argued that she acted out of fear, out of manipulation, and, strangely, out of love. They said that Dominguez was violent and controlling. They claimed that Karina only helped to hide the bodies because of the fact that she was terrified of him. Prosecutors, however, pointed to receipts. Literal receipts. Concrete that was purchased with Karina's credit card. The storage unit that was hired in Karina's name. Her vehicle, her suitcase. And they pointed to other behaviour too. Blocking family members who tried to see the kids. Calling police on relatives that were asking questions. Telling everyone that the children were in Arizona. They reminded jurors that not once in 6 years was there evidence that Karina had even tried to call for help. Not when Yesenia or Jesus Jr. needed her the most. Not even when the smell made her own mother joke, "Did someone die in there?" The courtroom was quiet when that quote was read aloud. It was the realization that a life had been reduced to a smell, that someone was now trying to just laugh away. After days of testimony, closing statements cut straight to the point. Jesus Jr. and Yesenia had quietly disappeared, and the very people that should have been responsible for their care had instead turned their car and their storage unit into horrifyingly disrespectful graves. When the jury returned, there was no hesitation. Karina Minyares was guilty. 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of abuse of a body. The judge delivered her sentence that same day, and it was final. No chance of parole. Karina would have no future beyond those prison walls. After the verdict, the courtroom shifted its attention to the only person still left to face their punishment. In September, Jesus Dominguez Sr., the one who took the plea deal, was sentenced to 32 years in prison. And now Karina Minyares has already begun serving life without parole. 2 lives were lost, countless lives were destroyed, 2 adults are behind bars, neither of which may ever get out. At 10:45 p.m, Louise Aitchison picked up her phone and dialed 999. Her voice was calm, measured, even polite. She told officers she needed help getting her boyfriend to leave. He was being difficult. He was being intimidating. He just would not go. Police arrived at her East Kilbride flat and spoke with both of them. They didn't run a background check. They didn't mention his history. They didn't know or didn't remember that Louise had already been flagged as at risk. So they let Daryl Patterson walk out, free to collect his things later, and then all hell broke loose. In early 2020, Louise Aitchison was trying to rebuild her life. She'd been stalked and harassed by her former partner, and the trauma of that ordeal had led to one good thing: a relocation. Her new flat on Park Terrace in East Kilbride was supposed to be a fresh start, a place where she could feel safe once again. To make this even better, she now lived just 2 closes down from her mother. She still walked her dog every day. She was reconnecting with her friends. She was smiling more, beginning to enjoy life once again, and then she met someone new. This new guy's name was Daryl Patterson. They crossed paths whilst walking their dogs. It all seemed pretty innocent, pretty harmless. They both loved animals, and Louise, with her enormous heart, saw something in him. She liked him so much that he moved in by March. But what Louise didn't know, and what nobody told her, was that Patterson already had convictions for DV in 2016 and 2017. And worse even still, he was facing new allegations from a previous partner at the time that he entered Louise's life. Less than a month after moving in, the signs were already there. Police were called to the flat on March the 24th. An officer, alarmed by Patterson's presence and known history, then submitted a formal request under Scotland's domestic abuse disclosure scheme. It's called a power to tell application. It allows police to proactively warn a person if their partner poses a known risk. So really, this sounds like an amazing idea. The officer flagged it, and a decision was made to tell Louise. The warning meant for Louise sat dormant in a system designed to protect her. It had been formally approved on April the 9th. That's when police officers agreed, yes, she needed to know. She had a right to be told that the man in her flat had a documented history of violence against women. Under police guidelines, that kind of disclosure must be made within 10 days. But when officers logged that report, they left out some crucial details. There was no incident number. There was no current mobile number. There was no confirmation of address. So all of this meant when another officer tried to follow up 14 days later, on April the 23rd, they couldn't even reach her. They attempted a phone call, but with no correct number on file, the effort failed before it began. And then there was no further attempt. The system did not flag the missed deadline. There was no red alert. Nobody noticed the oversight. And because the form lacked an incident number, other officers couldn't even find it unless they knew exactly where to look. But they didn't. So Louise was never warned. Even on the night that Louise called 999 herself and asked officers to remove Patterson from her flat, the responding officer didn't mention any of this to her. They just let Patterson leave. They logged the call as always, and then they left her there. According to Police Scotland's own watchdog, the Police Investigations and Review Commissioner, or PIRC, this failure was critical. Had she been told about Patterson's background, the report stated, she may have taken action to avoid him and ensure her safety. But by the time this disclosure was due, Daryl Patterson had already told officers he intended to return to the flat to pick up his stuff, admitting that he had no intention of staying away. Later, Police Scotland would defend their decision not to disclose this at the time of the 999 call, saying that it may not have been appropriate. But Louise's mother, Caroline Leon, later said they might as well have put a target on her back, because when no one tells you the truth about the person that you live with, it shows a level of negligence veering on betrayal. And now the scene is set. We move on to Tuesday night, where the sun had just set over East Kilbride. Inside the flat on Park Terrace, things were escalating. Louise picked up the phone at 10:45 p.m. and then dialed 999. At just 4'11" and barely 9 stone, Louise had no idea that she'd been left in a flat completely unprotected, with a man who had previously stalked, beaten and threatened other women that he'd been in a relationship with. But a small mercy is that he was ushered out of the home by police. However, as we know, this was done with the agreement that he could later pick up his stuff. And as you can imagine, a real slow-motion nightmare is unfolding before us. By the time police finally confirmed what had happened to Louise, Daryl Patterson had already tried to confess twice. His first stop was a friend's house. At 1 a.m. on April 29th, he showed up at Adam Ford's door. He was disheveled and shaking. Although he was in a state, he was still sober enough to say something chilling. "I've done something really bad. I'm going to go away for a very long time. My life's over." He then stayed the night with Adam. By the time morning arrived, he was now crying. But he still didn't just turn himself in. Instead, he drifted through East Kilbride, drinking heavily, taking substances, and spiraling into panic. He went to his sister Kaya's home next, and this time he said it plainly. "She's gone. I've done something really bad." When she asked what he meant, Patterson told her that Louise was in the bedroom of the flat, that she'd had a sharp implement, that there had been an argument, and that she punched me on the throat. He said, "I told her not to do that, but she hit me again. She was kicking me and things got ugly. Suddenly I was on top of her with my hands around her throat." Then, chillingly, he dragged his hands across his neck and added, "And then it happened." He told her that the weapon was in the kitchen and that he'd washed it. Patterson then made multiple calls to the police after that. One time he told them that he had committed a serious offence. Another time he said that he was carrying a weapon. But the system that hadn't flagged him as a serious risk still wasn't catching up to what had already happened. Even when police met with him in person, he wasn't taken into custody. He was sent to a hospital instead, and then released. By the time Louise's family began to worry, she had already been gone for days. Her mother Caroline lived nearby, and she was used to regular text messages and check-ins. But now, Louise wasn't answering. It was just not like her to disappear. On April 30th, police were finally called once again to check on her welfare. This would be their 6th visit to the flat since Louise had called 999, and this time they finally forced entry. Entering the flat set alarm bells ringing, and as they moved further in, the full horror was revealed. Inside the bedroom they found Louise's body. She had been carefully covered with a blanket. 3 sharp implements were later discovered in the kitchen sink, one of them believed to be the murder weapon, although it had been washed. The grief was immediate, but this wasn't just about the loss. It was the preceding silence, the delay, the unthinkable knowledge that Louise had been left alone in that flat, no longer breathing for 2 days, while police officers knocked gently on her door and then walked away. Later, her mother would be told that calling cards had been removed for evidence, but when Caroline visited the flat, there were never any calling cards to be found. When Louise's body was still lying there, the woman who had asked for help, the woman who had waited, the woman who'd been failed over and over again, and for 2 days, nobody knew. Or maybe it seems some people never actually wanted to know at all. It wasn't until April 30th, after Louise's body was finally found, that police located and then formally arrested him. By then, he had already tried to confess. It's not like he was hiding. Instead, he was publicly spiraling, but still he slipped through every single crack. When Caroline was finally told that her daughter was gone, the news was delivered in fragments. Officers didn't confirm it at first. They asked her what tattoos Louise had. They said that a family liaison officer was on the way. Meanwhile, outside the flat, flashing lights and police tape told the entire community what had happened. Friends were already trying to remove tributes from social media, hoping to shield the family from the worst of it. But Caroline already knew. The only thing she didn't know yet was just how bad this truly was. She wouldn't learn the details of her daughter's final moments until court. The family was advised not to view Louise's body, as her injuries were too extreme. There would be no final goodbye, no hand to hold, no face to touch or kiss. This shattered the mother, and then came the second shock. The paperwork, the timelines, and the failures. Mother Caroline learned that police had made 18 separate errors in the week leading up to Louise's demise. She learned that they had formally agreed to warn her daughter about Patterson's violent past, but also that they had failed to deliver that warning due to the missing details in the database. She learned that Patterson was already facing new allegations when he moved into Louise's home, that she had been moved to that flat for her own safety after being stalked by another man. And then, the one fact that wouldn't stop circling her mind, they had 5 weeks to warn her, Caroline said, and they didn't. This mother began demanding answers. Caroline spoke to MPs, to journalists, to watchdog groups. She sat down with senior officers from Police Scotland, where they admitted to her face to face that they had failed. She was told that now some changes had been made. There were new flagging systems, better procedures in place, but that there would be no disciplinary action, no names and no accountability. So Caroline kept on digging. She began pushing for a fatal accident inquiry, which is a formal investigation into the chain of decisions that had failed her daughter. She didn't want sympathy. Now she wanted change. And that's because, as she put it, maybe others can live with that on their conscience, but I can't. What we know about the night in question is this. Less than 1 hour after being told to leave, Patterson then returned. And once inside, he launched a violent attack. He applied pressure to the neck until Louise was nearly gone, and then came the sharp force strike to the neck. By midnight, Louise's time on this earth had already come to an end. She was covered with a blanket, and then Patterson just walked out the door again. Nobody was watching him. Strangely, during those 2 days, even though officers came to her door again, even though they knocked 6 times in total, it took them that long to force entry, even when she didn't respond, not even when it seems like all the signs were there. In January of 2023, nearly 3 years after her death, Daryl Patterson was sentenced to life in prison. He will serve a minimum of 18 years before being considered for parole. In court, Judge Lady Stacey told him she was entitled to look to you for love and support, but you betrayed her trust. You took her life. But for Mother Caroline, that sentence means very little. She still wakes up with questions. She still wonders what could have been done differently. She still fights to make Louise's death mean something. With the inquiry, there may be reforms, but what remains is this. A 33-year-old woman called for help, but she was not warned, she was not protected. That help never came. She spent her final moments alone with a monster in a flat that she was told would keep her safe. Susan Walters was still wearing her blue ER scrubs when she unlocked the kitchen door of her modest home in southeast Portland. The security alarm was beeping. This was normal. However, the curtains were drawn, and this was less normal. Her husband Mike had also left a strange note. This was definitely not normal. She took a few deep breaths, flipped through her mail, and then walked into the bedroom. There was a man waiting behind the door. He wore yellow rubber gloves, and he carried a claw hammer. He didn't say a word, he just swung. And what happened next, I guarantee you, is not what you're thinking. This is one of the craziest cases I've ever seen. Before her world unraveled, Susan Kuhnhausen had an entirely ordinary day. She ended her shift at Providence Portland Medical Center. She was exhausted but still in good spirits. And instead of going straight home, she stopped off at a hair salon on East Burnside. While she was waiting her turn in the chair, Susan picked up an Oprah magazine, and in it she read a poem that started, "I will not die an unlived life. I will not live in fear." And at that time it was just a line in a magazine, but an hour later, it would become her personal manifesto. At around 6:30 p.m, Susan pulled up to her house. It was a blue one-story Cape Cod, tucked behind a grey picket fence, in Portland's Montevilla neighborhood. Inside the mudroom was a note left by the microwave. It read, "Sue, haven't been sleeping, had to get away, went to the beach. See you Friday or Saturday. Love, me." The note was from Mike Kuhnhausen. He was Susan's estranged husband of 17 years. They'd separated around a year earlier. Susan had finally told him she wanted a divorce, but Mike hadn't taken it well. Still, she didn't find the note especially alarming. She just thought the whole thing was odd. Upon entering, she turned off the still beeping security alarm. She opened her front door, stood outside for a moment, enjoying the warm early September air, and then she came back inside. She slipped off her Birkenstocks. She noticed the curtains were closed in her bedroom, which was unusual, and then she stepped inside, and it was then that a man hiding behind the door lunged out. He was wearing yellow rubber gloves, and he had a red and black claw hammer in his hand. The man didn't hesitate. The first blow caught Susan on the left temple. This was hard enough to leave red leaking from her head. However, it didn't knock her out. Susan stumbled, but she didn't fall. The man swung again. Susan screamed, "Who are you? What do you want?" But she received no answers, just more swinging of the hammer. It was clear this wasn't a robbery. This was an execution. And Susan Kuhnhausen, standing just 5'4" and with 2 bad knees, made a split-second decision. She charged the intruder. She was not going down without a fight. Susan rammed her body into his, trying to push him off balance. However, the man stood solid. He instead slammed her into the wall, and that's when he spoke, just once, saying, "You're strong." Those 2 words rewired everything in Susan's brain. This wasn't a random encounter. She knew this man was there to take her out. The poem that she read earlier, being told that she was strong by this madman, it all added up in Susan's head. She knew what she had to do. She shoved him again and grabbed for the hammer. Somehow she managed to wrestle it away, and now she struck him 3, maybe 4 times in the head. The man now went down. However, he was not out. In a desperate battle for power, the man wrestled back control of the hammer. Susan, thinking fast, went for the next target that she could reach. That was his throat. She clamped her hands hard around his neck. "Who sent you?" she screamed. But the man didn't answer. His face turned red, then purple, then blue. Susan let go, terrified she might kill him. That wasn't something she wanted on her conscience. Instead, she tried to run, but he caught her in the hallway. It was now the man punched her in the mouth, splitting her lip. And then he struck her again. Susan now fell to the floor, and above her, she saw it. The hammer raised again, and it was then that she thought, "I'm going to die." The man standing over her was later identified as Edward Dalton Haffey, age 59. He had a record for robbery, burglary, and, critically, conspiracy to commit aggravated murder, and at the time he was high on a white substance. But none of that mattered in this moment with Susan, because right there and then, all he wanted to do was to end Susan's time on this earth. Or at least that's what he thought. Lying on the floor, dazed, leaking red, Susan reached for his leg, or maybe he just slipped. Either way, they were now both on the ground. The 2 of them were wrestling, and in a fight for your life there were really no rules. Susan bit his arm. She then bit his thigh. She bit him on the ribcage. She even bit through his pants, through the zipper. She was trying to leave marks. She was trying to leave a trail of evidence. To leave her mark, her DNA, on him. She was doing this in case she didn't make it. However, she was still determined to survive. During the struggle, she clawed through his pockets. She was hoping to find an ID that she could fling under a dresser, something the police could later find. She was still thinking like an ER nurse, even when fighting for her life. The man dropped the hammer. Susan then threw her left leg over his body and climbed on top. She locked her left arm around his neck. She pressed her right forearm into his windpipe. This was a chokehold, and it was locked in. "Tell me who sent you and I'll call you a f***ing ambulance," Susan shouted in the man's face. He growled and gurgled, but he didn't speak. She held the choke and just continued to hold it until he stopped moving. 14 minutes had now passed. Susan grabbed the hammer and she ran barefoot to her neighbor's house and then collapsed. Susan Walters, exhausted and shaking, had just survived a murder attempt inside her own home. The first house she arrived at was neighbor Ann Warnock, and she dialed 911. The call was kind of calm and eerie. Ann Warnock said, "We have an intruder in the house next door. The woman who lives there thinks she may have strangled him. He was down when she left. Dispatcher, can you put her on the phone? Warnock, she's bleeding. Dispatcher, does she need an ambulance? Warnock, no, she's a nurse. She says call an ambulance for the guy. He may be dead." When police arrived, they found Edward Haffey lying face down in the hallway. Autopsy results later confirmed the cause of death was indeed strangulation. In his pockets, they found a $5 bill. They found a crack pipe. There was also bus tickets and a small, partially used matchbook. He also had a Hershey syrup bottle and diabetes pills on his person. And next to his body lay the red and black claw hammer. There was no forced entry on the property. The alarm system had been disarmed, and Susan had a theory. She told detectives that her estranged husband, Michael Kuhnhausen, still had the security code. He also knew the layout of the house, and he knew that Susan would be coming home alone. The deeper the police dug into Edward Haffey, the darker the picture became. In his backpack was a folded up note. It read, "Call Mike. Get letter." Inside his day planner dated September the 4th were the words, "Call Mike," and next to it was a phone number. And indeed, that phone number belonged to Michael Kuhnhausen. Detectives traced the connection. It turns out that Michael and Haffey had worked together at an adult video store in town. Mike was a janitorial supervisor, and Haffey had recently been hired as a cleaner. As a side note, can I just say how big was that adult video store? It was so big that they needed a janitorial supervisor and they also hired cleaners. So can someone down in the comments find the address to make sure I don't accidentally go there? As we know, this wasn't Haffey's first brush with murder. Back in 1991, he arranged the killing of his ex-girlfriend, Georgia Lee Dutton, and this time it was a successful attempt. Her body was found decomposing near a river. He pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit aggravated murder in 1994, and he actually served 9 years, and he was released in 2003. And now, just 3 years later, he was laying cold in Susan's hallway. Kind of ironically, he met his end in the act of carrying out another murder for hire. When investigators showed Susan a planner with Mike's number in it, her reaction was instant. "I knew it," she said. "I told you it was him." Meanwhile, Mike had vanished, so police issued a bulletin, obviously needing to take this dangerous man off the streets. 1 week later, he was found alive, just 10 miles from the hospital where Susan worked. The day after his arrest, unsurprisingly, Susan finally filed for divorce. She also filed to legally change her last name back to Walters. She was, of course, finally done with Mike Kuhnhausen. But this isn't the end of her story. On August 30th, 2007, nearly 1 year after the attack, Michael Kuhnhausen stood before a judge in the Multnomah County Circuit Court. He had chosen to take a plea deal. That was 1 count, solicitation to commit aggravated murder. In exchange, he would avoid a full trial. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison, and thanks to good behavior, 20% of that would later be shaved off. However, on that day in court, Michael still had to face the woman that he tried to have killed. Susan stood before him. Her injuries had now healed. However, the photos didn't lie. The bruises and swelling, just a horrifying thing to see. She held them up, almost forcing him to look. You told police that you found out I was okay, she said. Do I look okay? She spoke for nearly an hour, and not for sympathy, but for clarity. She wanted to make sure the whole truth was heard. Later in a TV interview, Susan said about Edward Haffey, I didn't choose his death, I chose my life. After the sentencing, she filed a civil suit looking for $1 million from her ex-husband. And she didn't do this just because she wanted the money. She did it because she didn't want Mike to have the funds to hire someone else to finish her off. Obviously, Mike never paid this $1 million. However, he also never left prison. Even after he was behind bars, Susan Walters still didn't feel safe. She moved to a new home in a different Portland neighborhood. She installed a top-tier alarm system. She laid gravel around the perimeter so that she'd hear any footsteps approaching. She kept her doors and windows locked no matter what the weather. She called it her run plan. Because as far as she was concerned, this wasn't over. I spent the last 8 years hoping and praying he doesn't have any hidden funds anywhere, she said. I'm hoping he hasn't found someone in prison who said, you just hired the wrong guy. At stoplights, she would scan her rearview mirror. In parking lots, she now checked under her car. Every unexpected noise made her heart race. I've got a life sentence, she once said. I still live with the fear that he created. In June of 2014, 3 months before his scheduled release, Michael Kuhnhausen died of prostate cancer behind bars. He had no funeral, there was no reconciliation, so instead I'll leave you with Susan's final words to him. I wish him peace, and I wish for him to live far away from me. I'd say she got one better than that. It's 2:31 a.m. in Ilford, East London. The streets are all but silent. Only the hum of streetlights and distant traffic breaks the quiet. A man walks into the police station. He's alone, unrushed, and he's eating. He holds a white bag in one hand, a tray of food in the other. Steam curls up from the noodles inside. The desk officer looks up, puzzled. The man sets his food on the counter and says, almost casually, I've done the worst thing. The officer hesitates. What do you mean? The man takes another bite, chews, and repeats, the worst thing. The night before, the man looked just like anyone else, a man in his late 30s, a black jacket with 2 white stripes across the chest. He was walking down a quiet street in Great Baddow. CCTV caught him at 6:30 p.m, pushing open the door of the Blue Lion pub. Inside, the place was half full. Thursday night regulars, low laughter, and the stale smell of beer. He walked to the bar, ordered a drink, and stood there like it was just any other evening. Nothing about him drew any attention. He chatted briefly, he smiled once, and he drank his drink. But what no one in that pub knew was that, a few miles away, something terrible had already happened. After finishing his drink, he disappeared into the pub bathroom. There he stayed for a few minutes, and when he came out, he left without a word. Later, detectives would discover that inside that toilet cistern, beneath the water, was a black mobile phone. This phone did not belong to him. From the pub, he took a taxi to Chelmsford, in fact, to his grandmother's house. He knocked on a door, talked to her for a few minutes, polite and calm, and then he was gone again in another taxi, this time to a massage parlour across town. That massage parlour was closed, so he stood outside under the orange streetlight with his hands in his pockets, before calling another cab. This one was bound for Romford. At a second massage parlour, he stayed only briefly. The owner would later remember how distant the man seemed. By the time he left, it was after midnight. Then he stopped for food, a Chinese takeaway, chicken chow mein and spring rolls. The cashier there remembered him too. Calm, soft-spoken, he paid in cash and he wasn't in a hurry. Then the man did something that no one expected. He climbed into one more taxi and told the driver his destination, Ilford Police Station. The driver thought that he'd misheard, but the man repeated, police station. When they arrived and the man thanked him, he stepped out with his food in his hand, and then he walked towards the entrance, his face pretty unreadable. But what happened next made national headlines. A man eating his dinner whilst telling police that he'd done the worst thing. But that moment, the one that shocked everyone, was not where his story began. It began hours earlier, on a quiet street in Great Baddow, when a woman named Elise walked through the front door of his house for what she thought would just be a simple conversation. Before the headlines, before all of this, there was Elise. She was 37, a devoted mother of two, the kind of person who remembered your favourite song and then texted you when it came on the radio. Her family called her the glue, the friend who always showed up, the daughter who made hard days much easier. For years, Elise had lived in Great Baddow, a quiet corner near Chelmsford. It was the kind of place where people say, nothing like that ever happens here. Elise had been with a man that she'd known since they were teenagers. At first, it looked like a love that was going to last. They shared a home, a routine, and responsibilities. He had health problems and she helped. Medication, appointments, the small everyday acts of care. But something shifted over time. Kindness turned into control. Messages piled up. Calls came at all hours. Loaded apologies were blurred with pressure. By 2022, Elise made the decision that so many find impossible. She left the situation. She moved back in with her mother and she started over. Friends said that at this time she seemed lighter. She now laughed more once again, and she even found someone new, someone who made her feel safe once again. But not everyone can let go. In the weeks before April of 2023, the messages from her ex didn't stop. Some were pleading, some were calm, but all of them felt like strings were being pulled. And then came the request. Come over. I've got a birthday gift for you, a peace offering, a chance to reset boundaries. It sounded simple and it sounded safe. On April the 25th, just before 4 p.m, Elise left her mother's house. CCTV caught her walking with purpose, her coat on, handbag over her shoulder, and checking her phone as she approached Rothmans Avenue. At 4:42 p.m, she texted her new boyfriend, "You okay, babe?" And he replied at 4:49 p.m, "Course, babe." That message was never marked as read. What happened between those two timestamps would not be seen on CCTV. Instead, it would be pieced together later from silence, from red DNA, and from a room that forensically told the whole story. At first, they think he's just drunk or maybe unstable, but his voice is calm and measured. He even gives them an address, a small house in Great Baddow, Essex. Then he lowers his head as if the conversation is boring him. Officers exchange quick glances, because something about him feels wrong. It's not the words as such, it's his demeanour, his aura. One officer radios Essex Police. They send a unit to go and check on the address. As the man sits down, he continues eating his takeaway. Between mouthfuls, he murmurs, "I hope she's alright." But when they ask who she is, the man does not answer. By 5 a.m, officers arrive at the address that he mentioned, a neat, quiet house on Rothmans Avenue. The curtains are drawn and there's no movement inside. Officers knock hard on the door, but they receive no reply. They then force entry. What they find inside will stay with them forever. Near the front door, a blanket lies folded strangely on the floor. Beside it, a handbag, a pair of shoes, and a woman's coat. Beneath it all, a body, still and cold, unmistakably gone. Next to her, investigators found something small and unbearably human. It was a folded love letter, warm words about the future, plans, hope, and a life that she deserved. It's a scene that doesn't fully make sense, at least not yet, because only hours earlier, the man now sitting quietly at Ilford Police Station was seen laughing at a pub, ordering drinks, catching taxis, and going to massage parlours. To anyone that may have seen him, it just looked like a normal night out, completely ordinary. But it was far from it, and one of his stops at night, it did not belong. Her mum would later say, "She wasn't just my daughter, She was my best friend. Her children would now write about a home that suddenly felt too quiet, about birthdays that didn't sound the same anymore. And Elise's final message, "You okay, babe?" It's the words of someone kind, someone hopeful, someone reaching out for reassurance, but not having a chance to receive it in return. The man with the Chinese food, now in the police station, is making his confession. He seems to be admitting his guilt, but it doesn't appear he feels guilty. A supervisor arrives on the scene. They start asking questions and taking notes. What's your name? What address? What happened there? The man can't bring himself to mention Elise's name. But when officers arrive at the address at 5:18 a.m., the story tells itself. Her face bruised. It takes no time at all for the reality to set in. Back in Ilford, one officer turns towards a man and says softly, "They found her." The man does not flinch. He doesn't ask how she is. He doesn't get emotional. He just looks down at the empty food container in his hands. On body cam footage later shown in court, the man's voice can be heard, low, detached and almost curious. "You said you were working on her, trying to save her." But by then, there was nothing left to save. Elise had already been gone for hours. Detectives then took the man into custody. At first, he claims that he acted in self-defense. Then he says that she attacked him, that she had a sharp implement from the kitchen. But the crime scene tells another story. There is no sharp implement. There's no signs of a struggle that fits his version. Just a furious, one-sided assault, resulting in 70 separate injuries. Prosecutors would later tell the jury that jealousy was the fuse to this whole thing. That letter, those messages, the simple proof that Elise had moved on. They said that this was enough to ignite a rage that had been smouldering for months. And yet, Elise had done nothing wrong. She was just a mother trying to rebuild, trying to keep things civil, trying to believe that people can change. In the days that followed, detectives reconstructed his movements, his post-murder night out. Every step now became evidence of something chilling. They could see that he wasn't panicked, that he left the scene, had a drink, and he didn't even lose his appetite. By the time the trial began, almost a year had passed since that night, but in the courtroom, time felt frozen. Elise's family sat together in the front row, her mother Kim and her 2 children. Behind them, police officers, journalists and strangers, all waiting to hear the story told in full. The man, Mark Donovan, refused to sit in the dock. He stayed in a cell below the court, watching by video link. Even now, he couldn't face what he'd done. The prosecution's case was clear. Donovan had lured Elise to his home, and he then lost control after finding the love letter from her new partner. He then did what he did in a jealous rage. They showed the CCTV, where Elise arrived at 4:09 p.m, and then Donovan left 2 hours later. The footage of him at the pub, smiling, drinking, discarding her phone in the toilet cistern. Forensic experts described her injuries, more than 70 in total, the broken furniture, the bruises on her arms and hands, final proof that she had tried to protect herself. When it was the defense's turn to speak, Donovan still didn't testify. He claimed through his lawyers that it was self-defense, that Elise had threatened him, and that his poor mental health had clouded his judgment. But would the jurors believe him or her? They didn't even need 3 hours to decide. He was guilty of murder. When the verdict was read, the courtroom was silent except for one sound, Kim's quiet sobbing. After months of waiting, she finally heard the word that confirmed what she'd always known. Elise hadn't gone to fight him. Instead, she'd only fought to leave, fought for her own life. At sentencing, Judge Christopher Morgan looked towards the empty dock and spoke slowly. "You killed her in a jealous rage because she sent a message to her boyfriend. You attempted to destroy her newfound happiness. You have shown no remorse whatsoever, only self-pity." He paused before delivering the final line. "You simply could not accept that this woman was leaving you to find happiness." He gave him life in prison, minimum term 16 years and 50 days. But for Elise's family, no number could measure the loss. Her mother said, She wasn't just my daughter, she was my best friend and my soulmate. Birthdays and Christmases aren't the same. We miss her so much. Elise's daughter wrote, Mum was killed for trying to leave. She wanted a better life for us. Outside of court, Detective Inspector James Holmes stood before cameras. His voice was steady but tired. Today isn't about triumph, he said. It's about Elise and her children who live without their mum. Donovan is a dangerous, selfish and manipulative man. He can expect to spend the rest of his life where he belongs. And with that, the crowd outside the courtroom began to fade. The cameras turned off, but the story didn't end there. Because even now, on quiet evenings in Great Baddow, people still walk past that small house on Rothmans Avenue, the one where police broke down the door that morning, the one where Elise was found, as if she'd been trying to leave. Some nights there are still flowers left by the fence, cards that read, For Elise, we remember you. Elise's story is not just about this one night, it's about the weeks, months and years that came before it. The slow build-up of control, jealousy and fear. It's about how easy it is to mistake control and care, and how hard it can be to leave when someone decides that they own you. But Elise did find the courage to go. She had started over. She had found joy and love once again. And that's what really makes this story so devastating. She was doing everything right, but still it wasn't enough to keep her safe. Her case is one of too many. Stories where people are hurt simply because they want to live. If you're listening to this and any of this sounds familiar, the isolation, manipulation or fear, then please reach out. There are organisations local to you that are just waiting to help. Love is not control, and remaining silent will not keep you safe. Elise Mason was more than a victim. She was a mother, a friend, a light in her family's life. She deserved peace and she deserved safety. She deserved more time that she never got to have. But if her story makes someone somewhere reach for help, then maybe her voice isn't totally lost. It was just after 11 a.m. on a quiet Monday morning. Marianne Wilmont had barely left the community gardens when her fiancé, Jonathan Stasiak, picked up a chainsaw. He wasn't weeding, he wasn't trimming trees. He was walking down a narrow dirt path towards 73-year-old Jerry White, a man who was his former employer, a fellow trustee, and a long-time source of resentment. John had been stewing for weeks. He told friends just the day before, "Tomorrow, I go to war." Jonathan Stasiak and Jerry White had known each other for years. White was a well-known figure on the Isle of Wight. He was a Conservative councillor, a respected publican, and later in life a man dedicated to community service. He ran 2 pubs in Sandown, and he'd employed John as a chef in both of them. By all accounts, Jerry was generous. He was encouraging. He was a man that believed in second chances, and he often extended a hand to people who needed direction, and John was one of those men. Over time, their professional relationship evolved. Both men would become involved with a local volunteer project, Lake Community Gardens. This was a 16-acre plot, meant to serve as a therapeutic farm, a place to help vulnerable people grow food and to find purpose. John was trusted enough to become a trustee, where he would work alongside Jerry. But things didn't stay civil for too long. Behind the scenes, frictions began to grow. John claimed that Jerry used the garden merely as a dumping ground for pub waste, and there was a total of £3,025 between 2 different transactions that caused a major issue, but I'll talk more about that in a moment. John didn't just hold a grudge, he let it grow and fester, and privately he began speaking in disturbing terms. He began making threats. He hinted that violence may be the answer, but it seems nobody believed that he would actually do anything. To anyone on the outside, the tensions between John and Jerry did look kind of petty. At most, a clash of egos between 2 men with very different personalities. But to John, it was very personal. He believed that Jerry had bullied his partner, Marianne. He believed he was being disrespected, undermined and dismissed. This was both in public and behind closed doors. And worst of all to John, he believed he was being cheated. At the heart of this feud was money. There was a £3,000 donation from the local Rotary Club, which is a charity, and that money was intended for roof repairs at the garden. John was convinced that Jerry had claimed the full amount, even though the actual work, he said, only cost around £1,300. And then there was a £25 argument. That small sum, allegedly owed to Marianne for petrol, became a symbol in Jonathan's mind of everything that Jerry stood for, that being manipulation, arrogance, and dishonesty. And every minor issue that would come up, from damp firewood deliveries to plants being dumped near the sheds, added fuel to this fire. John kept tally. He started building a case in his mind, and in his head, Jerry wasn't just a difficult colleague. He was now a thief, a liar, and a threat. Jonathan's paranoia spiraled. He described feeling targeted at meetings. He believed decisions were being made behind his back. And eventually, he claimed that the entire community garden was being used simply as a front for Jerry's personal gain. Whether any of this was actually true didn't seem to matter anymore. By late May, John wasn't looking for compromise. He wasn't hoping for a resolution. He was just waiting for a chance. And that chance arrived on Bank Holiday Monday, the 27th of May, 2024. John and Marianne had spent the weekend camping out at the gardens. Marianne had just left to head home, and Jonathan, he stayed behind, and he had a plan. According to Marianne, there was no warning signs. She said Jonathan had been completely normal that morning. In fact, she could even describe him as relaxed. They'd been gardening together, they'd been walking the dogs, and enjoying the sunshine out in the wilderness. However, Marianne had no idea that just hours earlier, John had messaged his friends with a chilling phrase, "Tomorrow, I go to war." Jerry arrived alone and late that morning. John saw him from a distance, and he just decided to seize his moment. He entered the garden's clubhouse. Inside was a chainsaw, something that was kept on site for maintenance work. He took it, fueled it up, and started it. He then followed Jerry down a woodland path near the lake. In Jonathan's words, it felt like a movie. He claimed to be watching himself from the outside, but his action suggests he was anything but detached. He revved the chainsaw and struck Jerry from behind. He was swinging into his legs. Jerry fell to the ground. He pleaded John to stop, but the attack continued. When the chainsaw cut out and could no longer be restarted, you'd think that this may be the end of the attack. But instead, John turned to his bare hands. He now throttled Jerry and then smothered him. Witnesses would later recall hearing John scream, "Die, bastard, die," and then there was silence. John decided not to run. He sat there for a while, he had a drink and collected his thoughts. He then picked up his phone and dialed 999. He told the operator, "I've just murdered someone." When the operator asked if Jerry needed an ambulance, John's reply was chilling. "I'm going to make sure he doesn't." Police arrived just minutes later and found Jerry in the bushes. His time on this earth had come to an end. John Stasiak didn't resist. He didn't flee or lie or try to hide what he'd done. In fact, he seemed weirdly proud. When officers arrived, he led them directly to the scene. And even faced with what he'd done, John showed no emotion. As police cuffed him and walked him back to their van, John glanced back and said, "I hope the bastard is dead." This is the full available body cam footage from the arrest, and it's almost impossible to imagine what John had just done. The whole thing is eerie. It's not too long, and it's definitely worth watching.
Hey, John Steskowick. Steskowick. Okay.
No,
Did you... Steshuk, I'm sorry. Did you say you're confused, John?
No.
Okay.
No, you were confused.
Well, yeah, we were. We weren't sure which
You're
direction.
running around,
find you.
I'm not fucking confused.
What's up,
John,
mate?
based on the call you've made to us, Before we go any further, I need to arrest you on suspicion of
Hands out your
murder.
pockets to me, please,
Okay. So you don't
Thank
have
you.
to say anything
Behind
that
your
may
back,
harm your
please.
defence if you don't mention when questioned something which you later rely on in court, and anything you do say may be given in evidence. Do you
Yeah, I
understand what I've
understand
just said? Okay, and the reason for your arrest, obviously, is for a prompt and effective investigation
Yep.
and to prevent further harm to anybody.
Yeah.
If you can show us where the gentleman is, does he need medical attention?
Don't think so.
Okay. Where are we going? Okay. All right, let's just double lock those. Okay.
That's a bit harsh.
So I just need to make sure double locks.
If they tighten if you don't double lock them. We don't want to hurt you, mate.
Because you're handcuffed, I don't
Okay.
want to fall you over.
Okay, that's fine.
And whereabouts are we looking, sir?
We're going in here.
Yep. Any dogs in or anything? No.
It's just opening it.
Push.
Where are we looking, mate?
Keep going.
How far down then?
100 metres.
100 metres?
Yep.
Are we just following this? Should we keep John here, do you think?
Yeah, we're going to stay here then.
Yeah,
It's
keep
100
going.
metres straight, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Back at the police station, John gave a full account across 6 separate interviews. He told police that the attack was deliberate, that he picked up the chainsaw to give himself the edge in a confrontation that he had long fantasized about. He described the chainsaw as the most formidable item available. He acknowledged that he did want to finish the job. Jonathan said that he was glad Jerry was gone, and he would repeat this time after time, showing that there was no remorse. Detectives said that the only moment of hesitation came when they asked him why. He offered vague explanations, misunderstandings, disrespect, and petty grievances. He of course mentioned the £3,000 donation and the £25 petrol debt. But to the normal person, none of this added up to murder. This was personal and festering, and somehow it had finally erupted into this horrific event. The man they arrested was calm, articulate, and chillingly detached. One officer later said it felt like interviewing someone describing a dream, not a real-life murderer. At trial, Jonathan tried a different approach. He denied murder, and instead he pleaded guilty to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. The defense presented new psychiatric evaluations. One expert diagnosed John with autism spectrum disorder, and another suggested that he had autistic traits, but he didn't meet the full criteria. Jonathan himself told the court that hearing a diagnosis helped him to make sense of what had happened. He claimed the attack felt like he wasn't in control, and compared the scene to being in a movie. He talked about watching himself from the outside and acting without fully choosing to act. However, would the judge and jury be convinced? Midway through the trial, just before closing arguments, John abruptly changed his plea to guilty of murder. When asked why, he said he had misjudged the situation and now saw how callous his actions had been. However, his remorse would come far too late for the court and far too late for Jerry White's family. The murder left a hole in the heart of the community. Jerry had been more than a counsellor or a landlord. He was a mentor, a father, a grandfather, and a trusted friend. His widow, Lee, said the pain of knowing how he passed was unbearable. His son Desmond called it the bitterest irony that his father had been taken by someone he had once employed and helped. And yet, even as the court reeled from the brutality of the crime, Marianne stood by her fiancé. She publicly forgave John. She said she still wanted to marry him. And whilst this means that she faces abuse in the street, including assault, she told reporters she believed John would never hurt her and never do anything like this again. Her loyalty only deepened the community's confusion and grief, because while justice was being served, the scars were only just beginning to show. In his closing remarks, the judge didn't hold back. He described the chainsaw as an especially vicious weapon and said Jonathan had brought it that day, intending to remove Jerry White's legs, and he was so determined that when the machine cut out, he instead moved on to manual methods. The judge acknowledged the autism diagnosis but made clear, saying, "You obsessed over perceived, although relatively trivial, grievances, and to such an extent that you allowed them to build into a form of hatred. Nothing, no check dispute, no garden squabble, no petrol money justified what happened on that day. And behind every chilling detail revealed in court was the reality of a stolen life." Lee White, in a powerful victim impact statement, said, "Losing my husband under such horrific and unbelievable circumstances has led to major shock and anxiety. Knowing what he went through is hard to bear. Life has changed and cannot be normal again. I have underlying sadness for Jerry, but also fury and anger too." Desmond White added, "Dad was too generous and accommodating to the wrong people. People often took advantage of him." Jonathan Stasiuk now serves his sentence behind bars. The garden he once claimed to care for does remain, and so does the silence he left in his wake. In November, Judge Christopher Parker Casey delivered the final word. He sentenced Jonathan Christopher Stasiuk to life in prison with a minimum term of 25 years before parole can even be considered.
Did you plan to commit violence by searching up about how to fight with an axe, using darts as a weapon, how to win a fight against a bigger person?
On a dating app, a teenage girl began sending messages that frightened a complete stranger. The messages were not part of an argument, they were not obvious jokes, and they were not the kind of thing most people would simply ignore. Instead, they described increasingly extreme beliefs, hostility towards entire groups of people, and a desire to bring what she described as change to Britain. The man reading them became concerned enough to contact the police. A report was made, the information was passed on, and then, as far as anyone knew, nothing happened. Months later, on a busy Bristol high street, a barber stood outside his workplace, enjoying an ordinary summer afternoon. Within seconds, he would be fighting for his life. On August 2nd, 2025, 27-year-old Mohammed Mahmoudi was standing outside the barbershop where he worked, on East Street in Bedminster, Bristol. It was around 1:30 in the afternoon, and the area was busy with shoppers, customers, and passing traffic. Nothing appeared unusual. Nearby police officers were carrying out routine patrols, and local businesses were operating as normal. At the same time, 18-year-old Alina Burns was making her way towards East Street, carrying several weapons, including a scalpel and an axe. As Mohammed stood talking with a friend outside the shop, Burns approached him from behind. She swung the axe towards the back of his neck without warning. At almost the last possible moment, Mohammed moved. The strike connected, but not in the way Burns intended. As he turned towards his attacker, she attempted to continue the attack. Despite the shock of what had just happened, Mohammed reacted quickly and managed to wrestle the weapon away from her before she could cause further harm. The entire incident lasted only moments. Those few seconds would later become one of the most important facts in the entire case, because investigators believed the outcome could easily have been far worse. It was meant to be far worse. Police officers who were already nearby immediately responded to the disturbance and detained Burns at the scene. When they searched her, they discovered she was carrying not only the axe, but also a scalpel and 2 darts. Initially, investigators were left with a baffling question. Why would an 18-year-old woman attack a complete stranger in broad daylight, on a busy street, with multiple weapons in her possession? There appeared to be no personal connection between the two. Mohammed did not know Burns. There had been no dispute, no argument, and no obvious reason for the attack. As detectives began examining Burns's devices, writings and online activity, however, it became clear that the events on East Street had not emerged from nowhere. Instead, investigators believed they were looking at the final stage of a process that had been developing for months, in fact, for years. The deeper detectives looked into Burns's life, the more concerning the picture became. What began as an attempted murder investigation quickly expanded into something much larger. Investigators recovered electronic devices, notebooks, and written material from Burns's home. According to evidence later presented in court, they discovered extensive material promoting racial supremacy, ethnic exclusion, and political violence. She was deep into the party that dragged the world into World War II. There were also documents discussing weapons. There were writings expressing hostility towards various communities. Detectives also found evidence that she had spent months researching attacks, weapons, and methods of carrying out violence. Some searches focused specifically on axes. Others appeared to examine how somebody physically smaller than their intended target might still be able to overpower them. These discoveries point at preparation rather than spontaneity. The attack outside the barbershop did not appear to be a sudden decision, not one made in the heat of the moment. Instead, investigators believed it had been preceded by months of increasingly extreme thinking. One document would become particularly important. An email titled "The Dawn of Civil War" appeared to outline a worldview in which violence was viewed as a legitimate tool for creating political and social change. Other messages revealed increasingly alarming language and grandiose statements about her role in future events. By this stage, investigators believed they understood what had happened. What they did not yet understand was why nobody had intervened earlier, because buried within the evidence was proof that concerns about Burns had already been reported months before the attack ever took place.
Did you plan to commit violence by searching up about how to fight with an axe, using darts as a weapon, how to win a fight against a bigger person? Those searches were found on those devices. Did you make those searches? Did you write an email to yourself called "The Dawn of Civil War" as your manifesto or justification as to why you planned and carried out an attack and what you hoped to achieve?
Long before her name appeared in courtrooms and newspaper headlines, Alina Burns was growing up in circumstances that saw her young life thrown into instability and disruption. During her childhood, her family became caught in a prolonged housing dispute after their home was no longer suitable to live in. For years, the family moved between temporary accommodation and hotel rooms, while responsibility for housing them was argued between local authorities. The situation became so serious that the local government ombudsman later concluded the family had suffered a substantial injustice. For a child, it meant years without normal stability. Routine became difficult. Long-term friendships became almost impossible to maintain, and ordinary family life became increasingly complicated. Burns's parents, both teachers, attempted to educate their children while living in temporary accommodation. Eventually, the family secured permanent housing in Bristol, but the disruption had already lasted for years. When Burns later returned to mainstream education, the transition was not straightforward. According to evidence presented in court, she eventually stopped attending school altogether at around 14 years old. From that point onward, she became increasingly isolated. Her defense team later described the following years as a gradual withdrawal from normal social life. Again, investigators and the court were careful not to treat this as an excuse. Many people experience hardship. Many people struggle with isolation. Many people face difficult childhood circumstances. The overwhelming majority never pick up an axe and swing it, nor join extremist movements. Nevertheless, detectives believe those years helped explain part of the environment in which Burns spent her teenage years. As she became more isolated, she appears to have spent increasing amounts of time online. That was where investigators later discovered evidence of growing involvement with extremist communities, extremist material, and increasingly radical beliefs. Over time, those beliefs appear to have become more extreme. Then they became more personal. Then they became action. By the summer of 2025, investigators believed Burns had moved beyond consuming extremist content and had begun preparing to act upon it. Months before the attack on East Street, somebody had already raised the alarm. The warning did not come from a family member. It did not come from a teacher, because Alina had dropped out years earlier. In fact, it did not even come from somebody who knew Burns personally. Instead, it came from a man she had been speaking to on a dating app. According to evidence later presented in court, Burns began expressing increasingly extreme views during their conversations. She spoke about bringing change to Britain through methods she could not openly discuss. She made comments that promoted violence against entire groups of people, and she appeared to be moving far beyond simply expressing controversial opinions. The man reading the messages became concerned enough to contact the police. From his perspective, the messages crossed a line. They suggested somebody who was becoming increasingly radicalized and increasingly comfortable talking about violence. Imagine thinking you were going to hook up, but they just wanted to say some mad, nasty shit to you. A report was submitted. The information entered the system, and then nothing obvious happened. At the time, nobody could really know that the 18-year-old girl sending those messages would later be arrested for attempting to murder a stranger. It was only after the attack that investigators revisited the earlier report. Counter-terrorism officers later acknowledged that the warning should have been handled differently. They explained that police receive enormous numbers of reports every year, many of which ultimately lead nowhere. Determining which concerns represent genuine threats is often difficult. Resources are limited. Risk assessments are not perfect. But in this case, investigators accepted that opportunities had been missed. That admission created an uncomfortable question. Could the attack have been prevented? The honest answer is that nobody knows. It is impossible to say with certainty what might have happened if intervention had occurred months earlier. Perhaps nothing would have changed. What investigators could say was that the warning signs, the messages, the digital footprint, they all already existed, and somebody had recognized them.
Everything that we've seen leads us to believe that this was purely self-radicalisation online, so no real life contact with other individuals with a terrorist mindset. Unfortunately, this is a theme that we are seeing more and more in counter-terrorism policing, but also in policing more widely. That particularly younger people are finding themselves lonely and isolated, and they are exploring the internet and unfortunately finding very dark corners of the internet where they are able to consume large quantities of disturbing and sometimes terrorist material.
We actually had officers on patrol quite close to this incident, so being visible and present in our communities. And then around general neighbourhood engagement, as well as Operation Servitor, which serves around, particularly around counter-terrorism. So we're able to deploy a number of officers to a location, very concentrated, to actually look out for behavioural signs of individuals behaving in a way which would be causing us concern. So we could actually have that overt uniform present in an area for a particular amount of time to try and disrupt some of this activity.
By the time Alina Burns appeared before the courts, there was very little disagreement about what had happened. Witnesses had seen the attack. Police officers had arrived almost immediately. The weapons had been recovered, and Burns had already admitted responsibility. In January 2026, she pleaded guilty to the attempted murder of Mohammed Mahmoudi. She also admitted possessing the weapons she had carried on the day of the attack. The remaining question was not whether she had committed the offence. The question was why. Prosecutors argued that the attack was driven by ideology rather than any personal grievance. To support that argument, they presented evidence gathered during the investigation. The court heard about the messages Burns had sent online. The court heard about the material found in her home. The court heard about her writings, her research, and her communications with individuals connected to extremist circles. Taken together, prosecutors argued that the attack was motivated by a violent belief system centered around racial supremacy and exclusion. Burns denied a separate allegation relating to preparation for terrorist acts. However, prosecutors maintained that the attack itself remained ideologically motivated. After reviewing the evidence, the judge agreed. Mrs. Justice Lambert concluded that the offence had a terrorist connection that would play an important role during sentencing. The court also heard from Mohammed Mahmoudi. Although his physical injuries were relatively minor compared to what could have happened, the impact on his life was far greater than the visible wounds. In his victim impact statement, Mohammed described the scar on his neck as a daily reminder of the attack. He spoke about anxiety, he spoke about disrupted sleep, and he spoke about the psychological impact of being attacked without warning by a complete stranger. The attack had lasted only moments. Its consequences would last much longer. The court also heard that Mohammed had previously fled persecution and sought refuge in the United Kingdom. He had come to Britain looking for safety and a future. Instead, he found himself standing in a courtroom, describing how close he had come to losing his life on a Bristol high street. When it came time to sentence Burns, the judge delivered a stark assessment. She described Burns as a dangerous offender who remained deeply committed to her beliefs. She concluded that the seriousness of the offence, combined with the ideological motivation behind it, required a lengthy sentence. In May 2026, Burns was sentenced to 15 years and 6 months in prison. An additional 4 years on licence was added after her release. The total sentence amounted to 19 years and 6 months. For investigators, the case became an example of how rapidly extremist beliefs can move from online spaces into the real world. For police, it became a reminder of the challenges involved in identifying genuine threats among thousands of reports and pieces of intelligence. And for the wider public, it demonstrated that warning signs are often visible long before events occur. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of this case is that very little of it was hidden. Investigators were able to trace a clear line from those early warnings to an almost random axe attack. In October of 2000, police in Pakistan uncovered what initially appeared to be one of the most important archaeological discoveries in modern history. Inside a house near the borders of Iran and Afghanistan sat a stone sarcophagus containing a perfectly preserved mummy. The body was wrapped as ancient Egyptian mummies were wrapped. Gold covered the face and chest. Cuneiform writing surrounded the coffin, and according to the inscriptions, the woman inside was supposedly a long-lost daughter of the Persian king Xerxes. Experts believe they may have discovered the only known remains of Persian royalty from more than 2,500 years ago. But within months, the entire story began collapsing. Who was the Persian princess? And why did carbon dating reveal such horrifying results? Here we go. This story began with a videotape. In October of 2000, Pakistani authorities learned that a man in Karachi was attempting to sell a mummy on the black market for an estimated $11 million. The man was identified as Ali Akbar. Police later discovered that Akbar was circulating a tape showing the body inside an elaborate coffin, hoping to attract wealthy buyers interested in rare antiquities. At first, the entire thing sounded absurd. Mummies are already rare discoveries. But a previously unknown Persian royal mummy would have been almost unprecedented. During questioning, Akbar reportedly told investigators he was not the true owner of the mummy. Instead, he directed police toward a tribal leader named Wali Mohammed Riki, who lived in Quetta near the borders of Afghanistan and Iran. When investigators arrived at the property, they discovered the mummy stored inside a wooden shrine-like container. Inside sat a stone sarcophagus, and inside that was the body. Even experienced investigators reportedly struggled to process what they were looking at. The mummy appeared remarkably elaborate. The body rested on a reed mat coated with wax and honey. A gold mask covered the face. A golden crown sat across the forehead. The coffin itself was carved with symbols associated with ancient Persia, including the Faravahar symbol linked to Zoroastrianism. Most importantly, cuneiform inscriptions appeared across the coffin and chest plate. One translation read, "I am the daughter of the great king Xerxes. I am Rodagoon." That single line would become extremely important. Rhodogun was believed to have been one of the daughters of Xerxes I, ruler of the Achaemenid Persian Empire more than 2,500 years earlier. No confirmed remains of Persian royalty from that era had ever been discovered. Suddenly, Pakistan appeared to possess one of the most significant archaeological finds in the world. The mummy was seized and transported to the National Museum of Pakistan in Karachi. News spread internationally almost immediately. Archaeologists, historians, journalists, and collectors became fascinated by the discovery. But even during those early days, there were already problems with the story. According to Riki, the mummy had originally come from an Iranian man named Sharif Shah Baki. Baki allegedly claimed he discovered the sarcophagus after an earthquake near the Pakistan-Iran border. The story sounded dramatic enough to attract headlines. But investigators would later struggle to verify almost anything about him. Authorities could not even confirm whether Sharif Shah Baki was his real name. And despite the enormous attention surrounding the case, he eventually disappeared entirely. No one seemed able to find him again. Meanwhile, experts examining the mummy started noticing details that did not fit together. The deeper they looked, the stranger the discovery became. Once the mummy arrived at the National Museum in Karachi, experts immediately began trying to determine exactly who the woman inside the coffin was supposed to be. At first glance, many of the details appeared convincing. The body had been prepared in a style strongly associated with ancient Egyptian mummification. The coffin and inscriptions, however, pointed toward Persia. That contradiction confused archaeologists almost immediately. Ancient Egyptians famously practiced mummification. Ancient Persians generally did not. But during the reign of Xerxes I, Egypt was part of the Persian Empire. Some historians believed it was at least theoretically possible that Egyptian embalmers could have preserved members of Persian royalty. If true, the discovery would completely reshape historical understanding of burial practices inside the Persian Empire. Pakistani archaeologist Ahmad Hassan Dani publicly stated that the mummy appeared to date back to around 600 BC. That announcement transformed the case from a strange police seizure into a global archaeological event. The inscriptions became the center of attention. One translated line identified the woman as Rhodogun. Historical records did mention a daughter of Xerxes with a similar name. Very little was known about her. No confirmed remains existed. That uncertainty made the claim harder to immediately disprove. The coffin itself appeared carefully designed to reinforce the illusion. It featured imagery associated with Persian royal symbolism. The Faravahar symbol was carved into the wood. Rosette patterns similar to those found at Persepolis appeared across the sarcophagus. To many observers, the level of detail made the discovery seem authentic. The story spread rapidly through international media. Headlines described the possible discovery of a Persian princess preserved for more than 2 millennia. Curator Asma Ibrahim later admitted she became emotionally attached to the idea that the mummy was genuine. For a young archaeologist fascinated by ancient burials, the discovery felt almost impossible. She later described it as a dream come true. And as the excitement grew, the question of who actually owned the mummy suddenly became political. As news of the Persian princess spread internationally, governments quickly began arguing over who the mummy belonged to. Iran reacted first. Iranian officials claimed the body was part of Persian royal history and demanded its return. From their perspective, the mummy represented a member of the ancient Achaemenid dynasty, one of the foundations of Iranian cultural identity. Pakistan refused. Officials argued that the mummy had been discovered inside Pakistani territory and therefore legally belonged to Pakistan. The disagreement escalated surprisingly quickly. UNESCO became involved. Diplomatic discussions started forming around the discovery. Then the situation became even stranger when the Taliban also attempted to claim ownership. At the time, the Taliban controlled much of neighboring Afghanistan and alleged the mummy may actually have been smuggled out of Afghan territory before ending up in Pakistan. Few people fully believed the story, but the fact that multiple governments and political groups were now fighting over the same mummy showed how enormous the discovery had become. Meanwhile, the body remained inside the National Museum of Pakistan. Security around the exhibit increased dramatically. Insurance companies reportedly hesitated to insure it because experts still could not fully verify its authenticity. Financial estimates surrounding the mummy became increasingly absurd. Some reports valued it at tens of millions of dollars. Others claimed it could eventually become priceless due to its historical significance. For the public, the woman inside the coffin was still viewed as royalty, a perfectly preserved ancient princess. But behind the scenes, several investigators had already started noticing details that made them deeply uncomfortable. The inscriptions did not read quite correctly. Some symbols looked awkwardly copied. And perhaps most concerning of all, American archaeologist Oscar White Muscarella soon stepped forward with information that threatened to unravel the entire story before it had even fully begun. Long before the international press became obsessed with the Persian princess, somebody else had already seen the mummy, and they immediately suspected it was fake. Months earlier, in March of 2000, a man named Amanullah Righi contacted Oscar White Muscarella, an archaeologist at New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art. Righi claimed he was representing a Pakistani antiquities dealer. He sent Muscarella photographs of a mummy decorated with gold ornaments and ancient-looking inscriptions. The images appeared almost identical to the mummy later seized by Pakistani police. Righi also included a translation of the cuneiform writing. According to the translation, the mummy belonged to the daughter of King Xerxes, but Muscarella specialized in identifying forged Near Eastern artifacts. Almost immediately, he became suspicious. Some of the artistic details looked wrong. Certain carvings lacked the precision expected from genuine Persian craftsmanship. Some symbols appeared to be crude copies of authentic Persian artwork, rather than original ancient carvings. The problems only grew from there. After examining the inscription more carefully, another expert discovered major grammatical errors in the cuneiform text. The wording did not properly follow the structure of Old Persian language conventions. Even more damaging was the use of the name Rudugun. That spelling was Greek. A genuine Persian royal inscription from the era of Xerxes would have used the older Persian version of the name instead. To historians, this mistake was devastating. An ancient Persian king would never have referred to his daughter using a later Greek translation of her name. The inscription also appeared to partially copy the wording from the famous Behistun inscription created during the reign of Darius, Xerxes' father. It looked less like an authentic royal dedication and more like somebody piecing together fragments from historical texts they barely understood. By this point, Muscarella believed the mummy was almost certainly fraudulent. He reportedly informed authorities and cut off communication. But while doubts were growing overseas, excitement inside Pakistan continued building. Then forensic testing began producing even worse results. A section of the coffin underwent carbon dating. The wood turned out to be only a few hundred years old, far too recent for a 2,600-year-old royal burial. Investigators then discovered pencil markings hidden inside sections of the coffin carvings. The markings appeared to be modern guidelines, used before carving the symbols. Lead pencils, of course, did not exist in the Persian Empire. That discovery alone destroyed much of the mummy's credibility. Still, the most disturbing findings had not yet emerged. Curator Asma Ibrahim started noticing signs that the body itself looked unusually recent. There was visible decomposition fungus on parts of the face. The reed mat beneath the body also appeared far newer than expected. Then scans of the body revealed something even stranger. Some of the tiny ligaments inside the ears remained intact. That should not have been possible in a genuinely ancient corpse. Even with mummification, delicate tissue structures normally decay over centuries. But inside this body, some remained preserved. That suggested only one possibility. The woman inside the coffin had not died thousands of years ago. She had died recently. Suddenly, the entire case changed direction. Experts were no longer asking whether the mummy belonged to Persian royalty. They were asking something far darker. Who was the woman inside the coffin? How had she ended up there? And most importantly, exactly who was responsible? To answer those questions, investigators transported the mummy to Aga Khan Hospital in Karachi for CT scans and X-rays. The The goal was simple. They needed to see beneath the hardened shell of resin-coated wrappings without immediately destroying the body. What they discovered raised immediate alarm. The scans confirmed the body belonged to an adult woman, estimated to be between 21 and 25 years old. The mummy measured only around 4 feet 7 inches tall, making the body unusually small. But it was clearly not a child. Then radiologists examined the chest cavity. The internal organs were gone. The lungs, liver, kidneys, and brain had all been removed. At first glance, this appeared to support the idea of ancient Egyptian-style mummification. But the procedure itself looked wrong. Ancient Egyptian embalmers were highly skilled specialists, whose methods followed careful ritual practices developed over centuries. This body showed signs of much rougher work. Investigators discovered the brain did not appear to have been removed through the nose, as Egyptian embalmers traditionally did. Instead, damage suggested access had been forced through the lower jaw and palate area. The abdominal incision also appeared unusually large and poorly placed. Even more importantly, the heart was missing. In genuine Egyptian mummification, the heart was normally left inside the body because it was believed to contain the soul and intelligence of the deceased. Its absence suggested whoever performed the embalming either misunderstood ancient Egyptian methods or only possessed partial knowledge of them. The body cavity had also been filled with modern materials, including baking soda and salt, crude substitutes for the chemicals used in authentic mummification. Investigators later estimated the operation would have required enormous preparation, large quantities of chemicals, specialized tools, knowledge of anatomy, and a secure location where the body could remain hidden during the long drying process. This was not something a random smuggler could improvise in a single afternoon. Then, the scans revealed physical injuries. The woman's spine showed major trauma. Several vertebrae were fractured and displaced. Radiologists concluded the injuries were caused by blunt force rather than sharp trauma. The force appeared severe enough to damage sections of the lower spine and pelvis. And then investigators discovered the most disturbing injury of all. Her neck had been snapped. The spinal column showed a clear break near the upper vertebrae. Forensic pathologists later concluded the broken neck was likely the actual cause of death. At that point, the possibility of murder became impossible to ignore. Investigators still could not determine exactly how the injuries occurred. It remained possible the body had been stolen from a recent grave after an unrelated accidental death. But another possibility now existed. The woman may have been deliberately killed before the mummification process even began. That possibility transformed the atmosphere surrounding the case. This was no longer an archaeological investigation. It had become a potential homicide inquiry involving an unidentified woman whose body had been altered beyond recognition. As the fraud collapsed, attention slowly shifted away from the coffin, the gold ornaments, and the royal claims. Investigators now focused almost entirely on the woman herself. For months, people had discussed her as an archaeological object, a priceless artifact, a Persian princess. But once the forensic evidence emerged, the language surrounding the case changed dramatically. She was no longer being described as Vol.2. She became an unidentified young woman whose body had been chemically altered and publicly displayed, while the world argued over her value. That shift deeply affected several of the investigators involved. Curator Asma Ibrahim later spoke about how upsetting the realization became once the illusion disappeared. There was a real human body inside the coffin, and somebody had done terrible things to it. When pathologists removed sections of the hardened shell surrounding the mummy, additional details became visible. The woman's hair appeared naturally dark or grey, although the tips had been chemically lightened to blonde. Each finger and limb had reportedly been individually wrapped, in imitation of Egyptian burial techniques. Experts believe the mummification would have needed to begin extremely quickly after death. In hot climates, decomposition begins almost instantly. That meant whoever organized the operation likely already had the chemicals, equipment, and workspace prepared beforehand. The body could not simply have been discovered weeks later and casually turned into a mummy. The timing was too precise. That realization created another deeply uncomfortable question. Had the perpetrators already been waiting for a body, or had they specifically acquired or created one for this purpose? Forensic specialists attempted to reconstruct the woman's face using skull measurements and regional facial characteristics from populations near the Iran-Pakistan border. The resulting image showed an ordinary young woman, not an ancient princess or queen, just somebody who had once, recently, been alive, and whose identity had completely disappeared beneath the story built around her remains. Investigators never publicly confirmed who she was. No family ever officially came forward to identify her, and despite the international attention surrounding the case, the actual victim gradually became almost invisible within the headlines. The media obsession had centered on the fantasy, the lost Persian princess, the priceless artifact, the international dispute. Once the body was exposed as modern, much of that fascination vanished almost immediately. But the investigation itself continued. Police in Pakistan launched a homicide inquiry and re-interviewed several people connected to the mummy's discovery and attempted sale. Investigators also tried again to locate Sharif Shahbaki, the mysterious Iranian man supposedly connected to the body's origin, but he remained missing. Meanwhile, the woman at the center of the case remained unidentified. Years later, the body eventually came into the care of the Edhi Foundation, a Pakistani charity known for handling unidentified bodies. In 2005, the organization announced plans to bury her properly, but delays continued. It was not until 2008, nearly 8 years after the mummy's discovery, that the woman finally received a burial. By then, much of the world had already forgotten the story. As investigators reconstructed the operation behind the fake Persian princess, one conclusion became unavoidable. This was not the work of a single person. The scale of the fraud suggested coordination between multiple individuals with very different skills. Someone had created the gold mask and chest plate. Someone carved the wooden sarcophagus. Someone copied and inscribed the cuneiform writing. Someone sourced the chemicals used during mummification, and somebody possessed enough anatomical knowledge to remove organs and prepare the body. Even the drying process alone would have required major preparation. The operation also needed time. It needed privacy. It needed specific tools. Investigators increasingly suspected the fake had likely been created in Iran, before eventually entering Pakistan through smuggling routes near the border. Oscar White Muscarella strongly believed the forgery originated from one of the major artifact faking networks operating in the region, and there were signs the perpetrators possessed at least some historical knowledge. The forgers clearly understood enough about Persian and Egyptian history to create something superficially convincing, but they also made critical mistakes. They copied symbols incorrectly, used some wrong linguistic forms, and misunderstood key parts of genuine Egyptian embalming. The result was something strange. Not an amateur prank, but not a perfect forgery either. Sophisticated enough to fool large numbers of people initially, flawed enough to completely collapse under serious scrutiny. Then the case became even more disturbing. Reports emerged claiming 2 additional Persian mummies had appeared on the international market. According to some investigators, they seemed to be prepared in similar ways. That possibility terrified forensic experts, because if true, it suggested the Persian princess might not have been an isolated incident. There could have been others. Thank you so much for watching. I'm uploading daily true crime and dark content here on this channel, so make sure that you're subscribed, hit like on the video, and also drop a comment so you get shown more of my stuff. Please do be careful out there, and I'll see you tomorrow.